She found $12 million worth of stolen artifacts on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday night, someone was standing outside her house in a black SUV with the engine running. She had $47 in her account, a 7-year-old daughter asleep down the hall, and a case full of evidence against people who had already shut down one federal investigation and were not going to let a fisherman from Maine be the reason they couldn't shut down another. Here is what she did not do. She did not take anything, she did not run, she did not pretend she hadn't found it. She stood in the dark kitchen and looked at the shape of that SUV at the end of the street and made the kind of decision that doesn't come with a guarantee, only a direction. Most people would have kept the money. She kept her conscience instead, and it almost got her killed. This is the real story of Nicole Torres. And the question it leaves behind is one I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I first heard it. Have you ever found something that could change your life and then had to decide if keeping it would end it instead? That's the question Nicole Torres would spend the rest of her life trying to answer. Not because the question was hard, because the answer was. The alarm went off at 4:15 in the morning. She killed it on the first ring, not because she was already awake, though she had been for an hour, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a boot if you tilted your head and nothing if you didn't. She killed it fast because of Emma. 7 years old. Sleeps like the dead when she finally goes under, but gets there hard and takes the lightest sounds personally. Nicole lay still for another 30 seconds, listened. Heard nothing but wind off the water and the old house settling into itself the way old houses do, like they're sighing. Emma was fine. She sat up. The bedroom was dark, except for the faint blue glow leaking under the door from the nightlight in the hallway. The one shaped like a lighthouse that Emma had picked out at the general store 18 months ago and still needed every single night. Nicole had pretended it was for Emma's benefit. She stopped pretending around month 3. She dressed in the dark, didn't need light. 3 years of the same routine meant her hands knew where everything was before her brain caught up. Thermal underlayer, flannel shirt, the salt-stiff canvas jacket that used to have a working zipper, wool socks, the good ones, not the ones with the hole in the left heel she kept meaning to replace. She stood in the kitchen and drank half a cup of coffee standing over the sink, not sitting down, because sitting down felt like admitting she had time to sit. She didn't, she never did. Outside, the wind was doing its October thing, angry in a way that wasn't quite a storm, but wanted to be one, the kind of wind that gets into the gaps of a house and makes itself known. Nicole could hear it working at the corner of the kitchen window, where the caulk had failed 2 winters ago. She added it to the list in her head, the list that lived behind her eyes and never stopped growing. Fix the caulk, pay the truck loan, call the doctor's office about Donna's referral, buy Emma new laces before she ties the broken one wrong again and trips on the playground. Figure out how $47 was going to stretch until Friday. She finished the coffee, rinsed the mug, put it upside down on the dish rack, and went out into Harwick, Maine at 4:50 in the morning, where the only things awake were the gulls and the men who smelled like them. Nicole Torres had not planned to become a fisherman. She had not planned most things about her current life. That was the honest version, the one she told herself when she was tired enough for honesty, which was most mornings before the caffeine caught up. She'd grown up in Worcester, Massachusetts, middle of the state, far enough from the coast that the ocean was something you drove to on long weekends, not something you worked on. Her father was a welder, solid man, hands like geology. Her mother had worked 30 years as a registered nurse at a hospital outside the city and retired with bad knees and a reputation for being the one who told patients the truth even when the doctors weren't ready to. Nicole had inherited something from both of them. The practicality from her father, the stubbornness from her mother. The combination had served her reasonably well for about 28 years, and then stopped working entirely for a period of roughly 18 months, which was the Derek chapter, and which she no longer narrated in detail to anyone, including herself. The short version, she'd met Derek when she was 25. He was easy to like in the way that some people are, comfortable, funny, uncomplicated on the surface. they had Emma. Nicole had taken time off from the accounting program she'd been working through at a community college in Boston. She'd planned to go back. He left when Emma was 7 months old. Not dramatically, no fight, just a note on the kitchen table, written on the back of a grocery receipt. The kind of note that made it worse somehow, the smallness of the paper, the casual handwriting, and a silence where the sound of another person used to be. He'd also left, it turned out, a credit card debt of $12,000 that Nicole hadn't known existed, attached to an account in her name. She found out when the letters started coming. She didn't fall apart. She didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Emma was 7 months old and needed feeding every 3 hours, and Nicole's mother was 4 hours away, and her father had a back that wouldn't let him travel, and none of that was anyone's fault, and none of it changed what needed doing. She sold the apartment. She sold the apartment. What was left after the bank's cut, and have a buffer for a few months. She drove up the coast because driving kept her from thinking about the next thing, and she stopped in Harwick because she'd run out of highway she felt like being on, population 900. 3 restaurants, 2 of which were seasonal, 1 school that went K through 8 and sent the kids to a regional high school 40 minutes away. A harbor, a commercial fishing operation called Thomas Seafood that had been there longer than anyone could remember being alive. Before that it had been Briggs Seafood. Before Donald Thomas restructured and rebranded after his brother's trouble, but that was a story for much later. And around the harbor, the smaller operations. The independents. The people who owned 1 boat or 2 and went out before dawn because that was the only math that worked. Gary Anderson was one of those. 67 years old. Moved like a man who'd spent 40 years in weather that didn't care about his preferences. He ran the dock more than owned it. The distinction mattered to him for reasons he never fully explained. And he was the first person in Harwick who'd spoken to Nicole like she was staying rather than passing through. Not because he was kind in any sentimental way. Gary Anderson did not do sentiment. What he did was practical. He had a boat that needed a reliable renter. Nicole needed a boat. She paid on time. He taught her things. It was an arrangement, and arrangements Gary understood. What he taught her in the first year was enough to survive. The knots, the tides, the specific behavior of fish in the cold pocket of water. 2.5 hours northeast of Harwick, where the bottom dropped, and the temperature changed, and the mackerel didn't know yet that they were being hunted. How to read cloud formations at 5 in the morning, and know whether to push through or come back early. How to reset a motor that had flooded. How to not panic when a wave came from the wrong angle. What she learned in years 2 and 3, she learned herself. By now, Nicole Torres could read the Atlantic coast of Maine the way she used to read accounting ledgers. Looking for the patterns, the things that didn't add up, the numbers that told a different story than the surface suggested. The boat she rented from Gary was called Lucky Hall. The name was aspirational. That was the kind way to put it. The engine needed coaxing in temperatures below 40. One of the net winches had a catch in it that you had to account for, or it'd tangle at the worst moment. The bilge pump worked, but sounded like it was doing you a personal favor every time it ran. The hull was solid. Gary had told her that the first day, and she'd believed him and he'd been right, which was more than she could say for a number of things she'd taken on faith. But it floated. It ran. On a good day, it ran well. Nicole had learned to find the version of good she could work with. The thing about Harwick was that it had been in the process of dying for longer than anyone had been willing to say out loud. Not dying fast, not dramatically. The kind of dying that looked like living if you didn't add up the numbers. A business closed here. A family moved away there. The diner on Harbor Street that used to have a line on Saturday mornings now had 4 regulars and a pie case with 2 items in it. The school had sent 2 fewer kids to the regional high school every fall for the past 6 years. The fishing hadn't helped, or hadn't helped the small operators. What had happened was what happens in a lot of places that had once run on individual effort. The scale shifted, and the people who couldn't scale shifted with it, which mostly meant down or out. Thomas Seafood had 2 trawlers now, both equipped with acoustic fish-finding technology that Nicole could not have afforded if she sold everything she owned and borrowed against things she didn't. They went out at first light and came back with more in one run than Nicole caught in a good week. That wasn't illegal. That wasn't anyone's fault. It was just the arithmetic of the ocean, and the ocean did not make exceptions for single mothers from Worcester who were trying their best. Thang Chuk, the month before, Nicole had received 2 letters on the same day. She'd been in Harwick long enough to think in 2 languages sometimes, the English of her daily life and the shorthand of her own internal accounting, and Thang Chuk was how her tired brain filed things that had already happened and couldn't be undone. The first letter. The truck loan was 62 days past due. If she didn't make a payment within 30 days, the creditor would refer the account to collections. The truck was the tool. Without the truck, she couldn't move gear from the dock to the cold storage facility 3 miles up the coast road, which meant she couldn't sell volume, which meant the economics of the whole operation fell apart in a cascade that she had already mapped out, helplessly, in the back of her mind. The second letter. Donna Jackson needed additional cardiac imaging that her insurance covered only partially. The remainder was not an abstract sum. It was a specific number, written at the bottom, of an explanation of benefits form in the neutral typeface of a system that did not understand what numbers meant to people who had to produce them. Donna Jackson was Gary's mother. 74 years old, compact and silver-haired, with the efficient bearing of someone who had always had more to do than time to do it in. She had appeared at Nicole's door 4 days after Nicole moved in, not to welcome her, exactly, but to assess whether the person living here was going to be a reasonable neighbor and whether the child was going to be adequately looked after. She had determined, both in a single visit and then announced, without discussing it, that she would watch Emma during Nicole's working hours. Not as a paid arrangement. Simply as what was going to happen. Nicole had tried to establish a payment structure twice. Both times Donna had redirected the conversation with the particular efficiency of a woman who had made her decision and found further discussion unnecessary. So Nicole paid in other ways. Groceries left on Donna's porch, repairs done on Donna's fence by a handyman Nicole couldn't really afford. The specific attentiveness of someone who understood that the care being given was a gift and was trying to honor it without naming it, because naming it would make Donna uncomfortable in a way that neither of them wanted. And now Donna was having chest imaging, and the number at the bottom of the form was real. And there was also Emma's art class, $40 a month, which was the one afternoon a week when Emma came home with paint on her hands, and the loose, uncalculating expression of a child who had done something for no reason, except that it brought her joy. Nicole had cut a lot of things in 3 years. She had not cut the art class. She was not going to cut the art class. So the financial picture on the morning everything changed was this. The truck loan was a crisis pending. Donna's medical costs were a need she couldn't quantify. Yet, the rent was current only because Gary had let her float 2 weeks without mentioning it as a favor. And she had $47 and 4 days until the next sale. Every morning Nicole went out on that water. She was not pursuing a passion. She was servicing a necessity. The sea was not romantic to her. It was the place where the math lived, where the answer to the numbers problem either appeared or didn't, and most mornings lately it mostly didn't. She reached the dock at 5:10. The Kang, the harbor, at this hour had the specific quality of early morning purpose, men moving with the economy of people who had somewhere real to be, and no interest in taking longer than necessary to get there. She nodded to 2 dock workers she recognized. They nodded back. Nobody spoke. That was the code. The dock at dawn was not a social space. Brian Thompson was near her slip. 24 years old, tall, with the look of someone who had grown up in a place that had provided him everything, and was only now beginning to understand that provision was not the same as preparation. He was Donald Thomas's son. He worked on the family trawlers in a role that was nominally operational, but was in practice more like an apprenticeship in a business he would eventually inherit. An arrangement that Brian seemed to accept the way people accept the weather, as a condition of existence rather than a choice. He wasn't bad. Nicole had worked out that much. He was just the product of a specific kind of ease that made him occasionally thoughtless in ways he didn't register because he'd never had to register them before. Torres, Torres, Torres. He nodded. Heard mackerel are running northeast. Thanks. She didn't look up from the winch she was checking. He waited a moment. I could show you the sector. We were working it yesterday. I know where it is. He took the dismissal without much visible reaction, stepped back, moved away down the dock. She watched him go in her peripheral vision and then returned her attention to the winch catch, which needed the specific adjustment she'd learned to make in her second year, and which still, every morning, required deliberate attention. The Thomas seafood trawler was already moving out of the harbor mouth as she finished her prep. Big. Fast. The running lights making their patient arcs in the dark water. She watched it go and did the math she always did. What they'd pull from the northeast shelf before she got there. How much that would leave for a 22-foot boat with one operator, and then stop doing that math because it didn't produce anything useful, and the fuel burn, while she stood thinking about it, was not contributing to the $47. She cast off, eased out of the slip, pointed Lucky Hall toward open water and pushed the throttle forward. 2 hours and 40 minutes northeast, the shelf changed. Nicole could feel it before she could measure it, a shift in the water's behavior, the swell taking on a different character, the boat's motion changing as the depth dropped beneath her. She'd found this place in her second year, working outward from the spots Gary had shown her, following the logic of what the fish were doing, rather than where the fish had been. It had been a good find. It had been less good lately. She cast the first net, let it run, waited, pulled kelp, debris. One juvenile cod she threw back because it wasn't legal size, and because throwing it back was the right thing to do, even when the right thing to do was the same thing as losing money, which it was this morning. Specifically, she reset, cast the second net, worked the winch with the adjustment that kept it from tangling. Waited. The water was flat at the surface but doing things underneath, current moving in the direction that usually pushed bait fish through this area. Usually second pull. Better. Not enough. The kind of catch that meant she'd cover fuel and maybe $30 over. Which was not $47. Which was not the truck loan. Which was not Donna's cardiac imaging. She moved northeast another half mile, to the edge of a drop she'd discovered 6 weeks ago by accident, when a bad current had pushed her off course, and she'd ended up in water she didn't recognize. She'd caught well that day. The conditions now felt similar. The temperature read, the surface texture, the color of the water at the edge of where the bottom changed. She ran the third net. The resistance was wrong before she even started pulling. Too heavy. The winch strained in the specific way it strained when something large was caught up in the mesh. Not large in the way of a good catch, but large in the way of a problem. She cut the engine to neutral, let the boat drift, started the manual pull. The net came up full of seaweed, debris, the specific wreckage that accumulated in a water column after a big storm had moved through. She cleared it, reset, stood at the rail for a moment and looked at the water, which told her nothing, because the water did not have opinions about her situation. The Thomas seafood trawler was visible in the distance. She could see its wake. She could not see how much fish was in its hold, but she could imagine, and the imagination was not helpful, and she stopped doing it. She cut the engine entirely, let the boat drift on the swell, stood at the rail and let herself, for just a moment, stop managing, stop calculating, just stand there in the cold morning air and look at the ocean, which was vast and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with truck loans. And that was when she saw it. At first, a dark mass riding low in the swell, 200 yards off the starboard side, moving with the water, not fighting it, drifting. She looked again, not debris, rectangular, metal, the color of something that had been red once and had spent a significant amount of time in salt water since then. That specific shade of rust orange that coats things the sea has been working on for weeks. It sat low, very low, the upper edges barely clearing the waterline. A shipping container. Nicole stood at the rail and looked at it for a long time without moving. Long enough for the drift to carry Lucky Hall slightly closer. Long enough for the shape to sharpen from suggestion into certainty. She'd heard about this. Everyone who worked this water had heard about it. Gary had told her once, in the sideways fashion he used for information he considered important but not urgent, about a container that had come ashore on the coast in the late 90s. Industrial kitchen equipment, still packaged. The man who'd found it had paid off his mortgage. One case, Gary had said. In 40 years. And then he'd said nothing else about it. Because Gary knew the difference between information and encouragement. She reached for the binoculars. The container was real. 20 feet, maybe more. The door end was facing her partially. She could see the latch hardware, corroded but present. The paint damage along the visible face was extensive, long strips peeled away by wave action, the exposed metal going through its stages of oxidation. Barnacles had colonized the lower edges in a way that suggested weeks of submersion, not hours. Weeks she lowered the binoculars, thought about Emma, thought about the truck loan letter. Thought about Donna's imaging costs and the art class that was $40 a month and the $47 that needed to stretch to Friday. She thought, if I don't go to it, someone else will find it before the day is out. She started the engine. The decision, later, was the part she couldn't explain cleanly. Not because she didn't know why she'd made it. She knew exactly why. Because why was simple, and the simple version made her sound reckless, and she wasn't reckless. Reckless people didn't budget $47 across 4 days with a calculator and a notepad. What she was, what she'd been for 3 years, and probably longer if she was being honest with herself, was a person who had run out of margin. Not dramatically. Not in a way that showed. Just the slow accumulation of not enough, month after month, until the only strategy left was not letting anything else go wrong. A container in the water wasn't a solution. She knew that. But it was an unknown quantity, and unknown quantities were the only kind that still held potential. Everything known in Nicole Torres's financial life was already calculated, already allocated, already coming up short. She came alongside carefully. The water between the hull of Lucky Hall and the container wall was behaving unpredictably, the swell pushing them together and pulling them apart in rhythms that didn't match each other. She kept the engine in neutral and let the drift bring her close, then corrected with short bursts. The smell reached her before she was near enough to touch anything. Salt and rust and something older underneath both of those. The compressed exhale of a sealed space that had been sealed for a long time. Not rot, not anything that had gone bad. Something more like stilled air, like a room that had been closed for years and was waiting. She got the rope on the 3rd try, first attempt. The loop caught nothing, fell short, slapped the surface. 2nd attempt, it hooked the lower rail, but the angle was wrong and slipped free when she pulled. 3rd time she threw differently, compensating for the push of the swell, and the loop caught on a protruding latch near the upper edge of the door frame and held. She pulled it taut, tested, clipped the free end to the stern cleat, put her hand on the cleat, and felt the tension in the line, and thought about what she was asking of a 22-foot boat, with a stubborn bilge pump, and a winch with a temper. Then she looked at the container again, at the far edge of the visible door panel, near the lower corner. There was something wrong. She couldn't fully identify it from here. The distance, the low angle of the morning light, the movement of the water. But something about that corner didn't match the rest of the corrosion pattern. She filed it without naming it. Pushed the engine into forward. Lucky Hole shuddered. The rope snapped taut and the bow dipped and the stern lifted in the specific way that said too much weight, and she did not reduce the throttle. She eased it. Not back, but incrementally forward, by degrees, the way you handle something that has the capability to flip you if it decides to. The container resisted, then gave, then moved, low, reluctant, like something that had been in the water long enough to form an opinion about being there, but it moved. She held the course toward the eastern headland and thought about nothing except the horizon line and the rope tension and the sound of the engine, which was telling her it was working very hard and had concerns. She acknowledged the concerns and did not act on them. In the back of her mind, through all of it, the image of Donna opening her door 4 days after Nicole moved in, standing there, assessing, deciding without being asked that this was a household that needed steadying, and that she was going to be the person who steadied it, not out of sentiment. Out of the particular practical love of someone who saw a need and had the means to address it. Nicole pulled the container towards shore because she needed money, but she also did it the way she did most hard things, by thinking about the people whose stability depended on her not giving up on the hard things. And that made the rope feel manageable, even when her shoulders were burning, and the engine was arguing, and the swell had shifted 30 degrees, and was pushing them sideways, and she had to correct 3 times in 20 minutes just to keep the heading. It took 2 hours. When the container ground onto the sand flat on the eastern beach, with a sound like something heavy finally accepting its situation, Nicole sat down on the deck of Lucky Hall and put her hands in her lap and breathed. The eastern beach had no name that anyone used. It was a gray sand cove between the headland point and the next rise, backed by a fieldstone seawall that had been someone's project once, and was now just slowly becoming part of the landscape. The old coastal survey had put a maintenance dock here years ago. What remained of the dock was a line of pilings with structural ambitions. The beach was accessible from the sea, but invisible from the coast road, and mostly screened from the harbor by the headland itself. Gary had shown it to her in her second month, when a squall had pushed them in here to wait it out. She'd remembered it the way she remembered useful geography, not consciously, but as a filed option that was available when needed. She waded ashore. The water was cold enough to feel through 2 layers of sock. She didn't address it. She walked up to the container and stopped. At the lower left corner of the door frame, she could now see clearly what she'd half-registered from the boat. Tool marks, fresh ones. The metal at the edges of the marks was still bright, not yet dulled by salt air, not yet beginning the process of oxidation that everything here underwent within days. A pry bar or crowbar had been applied to this door recently. Not in the far past, recently. Within the past day or two, based on the condition of the exposed metal. Someone had tried to open this container before she found it. She stood and looked at those marks for a long time. Then she went back to Lucky Hall and collected her tools. The crowbar was 14 inches, handle wrapped in black electrical tape that Gary had rewrapped the previous winter without being asked. The hammer was heavier. The flashlight was the waterproof kind, rated to 30 meters, which was overkill for a fishing boat, but Gary had insisted on it. She'd stopped questioning Gary's insistences 2 years ago. She worked the door for 40 minutes. The lock mechanism had corroded nearly solid. Not quite impossible, but close. She pried at the seam in fractions. Repositioned twice when the angle wasn't generating enough leverage. Her fingers went numb around minute 20. Her shoulders burned through minute 35. The door groaned once, a long metallic complaint that echoed off the headland and sent birds scattering from the sea wall. Then, with a sound like a pressure system releasing, a dull, hollow exhale, the mechanism gave. The door opened inward 6 inches, blocked by something inside. Nicole wedged the crowbar to hold it, put her shoulder against the door, and used everything she had left. 8 inches. 10. Enough. She turned sideways, slid through, raised the flashlight, and did not move. The beam swept left, then right, then back to center. The shapes resolved. The shadows organized stews, stone. Several of them, the tallest reaching her shoulder, secured to bracket frames welded into the container walls with industrial strapping that had held through everything the Atlantic had done to them. Carved faces holding an expression she couldn't name. Not serene, not stern. Something in between that felt like patience accumulated over centuries, bronze pieces beside them, coated in the specific green of real age. Shields or things shaped like shields. Figures intertwined, caught mid-motion, the detail work visible even under oxidation. On the right side, wooden crates, some sealed, some fractured at the corners from impact, the fractures showing carved wood inside. A mask with elongated proportions, a bowl rim with geometric pattern work that was too precise to be incidental. She breathed. The air inside was cold and sealed and carried a mineral quality. Stone and bronze and old wood, the smell of things made in a specific place and time, and then sealed into a metal container and floated across an ocean until someone pried the door open with a 14-inch crowbar on a beach in Maine. She touched the edge of one of the stone statues. Just the corner. The surface was cold and very smooth where it was finished, and rougher where the carving hadn't been meant to be seen. She pulled her hand back. This was not hers. The knowing was not deliberated. It was simply there, the way basic mathematics is there once you read the numbers. This was not cargo that had fallen from a ship. This was not lost property waiting for a claim. This was old. It was significant. And it belonged to someone else. Many someone else's. Whole cultures of someone else's, whose connection to these objects was older and more specific than anything Nicole Torres could claim. She swept the flashlight again. Slower. Looking for the detail she always looked for, the one that explained the part that didn't yet make sense. She found it in the far left corner, wedged between two crates. At an angle in the narrow space between the container wall and the stack was a hard-sided case. Polypropylene. Military-style latches. The foam visible at the seam, the compressed waterproof kind. She crossed the container, crouched, set the flashlight on the floor and opened the case. Inside, paper, protected by 2 layers of waterproof sleeve. She counted, automatically, because that was what she did. 14 documents visible in the top layer alone. Manifests, shipping records. Photographs taken on phones, outdoor sites, roped-off excavations, men in shirt sleeves working with professional focus. Emails printed out. Names that shifted across pages the way real names didn't. Company names. Meridian Acquisitions, West Holdings, Global Trade Partners LLC. And at the bottom of the stack, in a sealed inner sleeve, a handwritten note in tight print. Package Delta. Reroute necessary. Newark situation unresolvable. Thomas window is closed. Abandon per protocol. Retrieve when viable. She sat back on her heels and read it again. This container had not been lost. It had been abandoned. By people who had a protocol for abandoning things, who referred to a local contact as Thomas, who named their stolen cargo with logistics codes like it was a quarterly shipment. And someone had already been at that door, before her, with tools, and hadn't gotten through, which meant they were coming back. She took out her phone, photographed every document, both sides. In sequence. Filed them in a folder labeled with the date, which was a habit from accounting, and which she understood, in this moment, might be more than a habit. Then she closed the case, latched it, tucked it under her left arm, and stood up. The carved faces watched her from their straps. She looked at them, and thought of her father, the welder from Worcester, the man who had returned a stranger's wallet with $300 in it, and said nothing about it until dinner when he'd said, "The things you take for the wrong reasons stay with you different than the things you earn." She hadn't understood it at 9. At 30, standing in a stolen container with a case full of evidence against people she didn't yet know the names of. She understood it with the clarity of something that had always been true and had simply waited for the right moment to become visible. She was going to give this to the authorities. All of it. The decision didn't make her feel lighter. It made her feel oriented, which was different. Not relief, but direction. The needle settling to north, even when north pointed toward difficulty. She stepped out of the container into the October light, which had gone silver-gray while she was inside. She looked at the tool marks on the door. Looked at the sand below them. Looked at the water. Then she waded back to the boat, stowed the case, started the engine. First try, which it had never done in 40-degree weather, and pointed the bow toward Harwick. The morning had started at 4:15. It was past 8 now. In less than 4 hours, the shape of her life had changed in a direction she hadn't chosen and couldn't reverse. She pointed the bow toward town and tried to decide whether she was afraid. She was. But she was also underneath the fear, something else she didn't have a word for yet. Something that felt like the specific weight of knowing exactly what you're going to do next, even when what you're going to do next is hard. She kept her speed steady. She didn't look back at the beach. She got back to the harbor at 9:12, tied up, unloaded what little she had from the nets. Not enough to matter, not enough to mention. Nodded to 2 men on the dock who nodded back and asked nothing, because that was the code. You didn't ask why someone came back light. You already knew the general shape of it, and the specific details were that person's to keep. The case was under the bench seat. wrapped in a dry bag she used for personal items on wet days. She'd put a rain jacket on top of it, which was either careful or paranoid, and she hadn't decided which. Both, probably. Both at the same time, which was a condition she was becoming familiar with. Gary was at the end of the dock when she came up the ramp. He looked at her hands, looked at the boat, looked at her face, in that order, which was the order that told you what Gary Anderson considered most informative about a person's morning. "Rough out there," he said. "Not a question. Productive," she said, which was technically accurate in a way she was not prepared to elaborate on. Gary held the thermos of coffee he always carried at this hour and studied her for a beat longer than he usually studied things. Gary Anderson had spent 60 years reading weather and had learned that the thing worth watching was not the visible surface, but what was moving underneath it. He looked at her with that attention, the kind that noticed and didn't announce what it had noticed. And then he picked up the thermos and walked back toward the dock shack and said nothing further, which was Gary's version of giving her room, and which she received as the gift it was. She drove home. The case rode in the passenger footwell, between the dash and her feet, wedged against the heater vent. The truck's heater made a sound like it had a respiratory condition, which she'd been meaning to have looked at since February, and which had not moved up the priority list, because nothing ever moved up the priority list without something else moving down. She parked in the driveway, sat in the truck for a moment. The house was gray clapboard with white trim that had gone to cream at the edges. The kitchen light was on. That meant Donna was there, which meant Emma was there, which meant Nicole had to go inside looking like a person who had not spent the past 4 hours pulling a container full of stolen cultural artifacts onto a beach and reading documents that implicated someone in a criminal network operating across multiple continents. She picked up the case, went inside. Emma was at the kitchen table with a drawing spread in front of her and the look of deep professional concentration she applied to creative work, a focus that Nicole found both recognizable and mysterious. Recognizable, because it was clearly inherited from somewhere, and mysterious, because it hadn't come from Nicole or Derek, as far as she could tell, but from some ancestor who had done serious work and whose seriousness had skipped a generation and landed in a 7-year-old in coastal Maine who used it primarily for marine biology illustration. "There's a fish," Emma said, without looking up, "that lives really deep and has lights on it, like Christmas lights but attached to its head. Can I draw that? Anglerfish. Different from what you're drawing now, but yes." Emma nodded with the gravity of someone filing a permit. Kept drawing. Donna Jackson was at the counter with coffee and the particular quality of stillness she had when she'd noticed something and decided not to raise it yet. She looked at Nicole. Looked at the shoe bench where Nicole had set the case behind the rack. Looked back at Nicole. "You eat?" Donna said, "I had coffee at 4. That's not what I asked. I'll eat. I need to make a call first." Donna held the look for one more second, which was long enough to communicate everything she'd registered and chosen not to say. Then she turned to the counter and poured a second cup of coffee, placed it where Nicole would reach it when she was ready, and went back to being apparently occupied with the dish towel she was folding. That was Donna Jackson. You had to know the language. The coffee placed without comment was the language for, "I see that something is happening. I am here. I will not push, but I am not going anywhere either." Nicole took the coffee and went to the bedroom. She spread the documents on the small desk she used for the household accounting. The one surface in the house that was exclusively hers, that Emma had been taught not to touch, that held the folder of bills and the notepad with the running ledger and the calculator she still used by hand, because old habits from the accounting program died slowly. She pushed the bills aside, laid the documents out. She went through them the way she'd learned to go through accounting records. Systematically, from the largest structural items down to the details, noting anomalies, building the picture before drawing conclusions. It took close to 2 hours. She took notes on the same notepad she used for the household ledger, which struck her later as the kind of irony that was too on the nose to be comfortable. 4 countries of origin confirmed from the manifest language: Nigeria, Mali, Ghana, Benin. The items described with a specificity that indicated expertise, not a customs form filled out by someone approximating, but documentation produced by someone who knew exactly what they were cataloging. Provenance notations, dating approximations, condition assessments. The language of people who understood the value of what they were moving and had created a paper trail sophisticated enough to navigate institutional borders while being deliberately obscure enough to survive casual scrutiny. Several items were flagged in a margin column with the initials IA. She searched on her phone. Interpol alerts. Cultural property under active international search. She sat back. Active international search meant people with authority and resources were already looking. It meant the container showing up on a beach in Harwick, Maine, was not a quiet event. It was the end point of a trail that stretched back through multiple jurisdictions and that other people with more institutional capacity than a solo fisherman with a crowbar, were already trying to follow. The routing history in the shipping manifests: Abidjan to Lagos, Lagos to Rotterdam. Rotterdam to an intermediate point she couldn't decode from the form's reference system. Final destination listed as a company called Global Trade Partners LLC, at an address in Newark, New Jersey. In the margin of the final manifest page, a handwritten addition in pencil. Reroute per EH, Newark compromised. Thomas hold pending. Thomas. Again, she searched Global Trade Partners LLC, a state business registration. Filed 18 months ago. Registered agent at a UPS store address in Delaware. Officers listed by names that appeared nowhere else in any search she could run. The company existed on paper and only on paper, which was itself a kind of evidence. A shell built to move things and then be dissolved when it had served its purpose. Meridian Acquisitions, a more elaborate construction. A website that had been live for 8 months before going dark. She found it in an archive. Presented as an art and antiquities consultancy. Listed 2 directors. One name she couldn't trace. The other had a LinkedIn profile. She found it. Read it twice. Past employment included a Maine-based seafood distribution company. She set the phone down. Put both hands flat on the desk. The word Thomas in the handwritten note was not a coincidence. It was a contact, a Maine contact, connected to a seafood distribution operation, which, in a town the size of Harwick, with one significant seafood company, was not a connection that required significant analytical effort to complete. Thomas Seafood. Donald Thomas. She sat with that for a long time, not because the conclusion was uncertain, but because the implications of a certain conclusion needed a moment to settle into their full shape. Donald Thomas was not an abstraction. He was the man whose trawlers she watched leave the harbor every morning. He was Brian Thompson's father. He was part of the economic texture of Harwick in a way that was structural, in a way that meant his involvement in something like this had implications that spread beyond him to everything connected to him. She photographed the LinkedIn profile, added it to the folder. Then she closed the phone, went back to the kitchen. Emma had moved from the anglerfish to something that appeared to involve 2 whales and a disagreement. Donna was reading a library book with the focused attention of someone who had read it before and was looking for something she'd missed the first time. The coffee on the counter where Donna had left it was still warm. Nicole made a sandwich she didn't particularly want and ate half of it at the counter. Donna. She kept her voice at the level of ordinary conversation. Has anyone been asking around the harbor lately about the Eastern Cove area? Currents, tidal patterns, that kind of thing. Donna looked up from the book with the specific quality of attention she used when she'd been waiting for a question, and it had finally arrived. Gary mentioned a boat last week, she said. Dark hull. He didn't recognize the registration. It idled outside the harbor entrance for about an hour, and then moved south along the coast. Did anyone come ashore from it? Not that Gary saw. Donna closed the book, keeping her finger in the page. He thought it might be looking for a mooring. Nobody came to the dock office. A pause. Why? Something I noticed this morning, Nicole said. Which was true, and which Donna heard in full, including the part that went unsaid. Because Donna Jackson had been reading people for 74 years had gotten very good at the parts that didn't get spoken. She looked at Nicole for a moment, then opened her book again. Emma's reading program packet is due Thursday, she said. And she needs boot liners before the temperature drops another 10 degrees. I know. Just making sure the list is current, Donna said, in the tone of a woman maintaining a different kind of accounting. One that tracked what the people she cared for needed before those people thought to track it themselves. After Donna and Emma left at midday, Nicole drove back to the eastern beach. She parked above the sea wall and walked down. The container was where she'd left it, fully grounded now, the tide having pulled back to expose the sand flat completely. In the afternoon light, from the beach, it was larger than it had seemed from the water. A significant object against gray sand, not subtle. Not if you were looking. She walked around it once, slowly, and stopped at the door end. The sand here was coarse. Too coarse to hold prints the way wet mud held them. But coarse sand disturbed by foot traffic showed the disturbance in its own way. The surface texture disrupted. The small stones shifted from their settled positions. Two distinct areas of disturbance near the door. Two different sole patterns visible in the better preserved patches. One set deeper than the other, a weight difference, suggesting two people of different builds. The tracks came from the water side of the beach. No marks on the seawall path she'd descended. They'd arrived by boat, come directly to the door end of the container, not circling, not exploring, straight to the door, as if they knew what was inside and where it would be, and they'd worked at the existing tool marks. She could see it. The bright metal at the edges of the previous marks had been worked again, more recently, and hadn't succeeded, or had been interrupted. They'd come back. After she'd found it. While she was home reading the documents. And they'd left because they still hadn't gotten the door open, but they knew the container was here, on this beach. And they were going to come back again. She stood on the cold sand and did the math of time. How long before they returned? How long before someone from a boat running the coastline would be able to see the red shape on this flat from the water and confirm its position? How long she had, not long. That was the answer to all three versions of the question. She walked back up to the truck, got in, did not start it immediately, sat with her hands on the wheel and thought about Timothy Clark. She'd heard about Clark from Gary. In the lateral way, Gary transmitted information he considered relevant but not urgent. Tim Clark used to do real work out of Portland, federal adjacencies. Transferred here 6 years ago when his wife got sick. Wife died. He stayed. Gary had said it without editorializing, which was Gary's way of editorializing. You listened to what he didn't say about a person as much as what he did. And 3 days ago on the dock, Brian Thompson had said the name in a different context. They'd been discussing something unrelated, a problem with the dock's fuel pump. And Brian had mentioned offhandedly that Clark was the person to call if something needed to actually get handled, as distinct from being noted and filed. Brian had said it the way people said things about institutions they'd come to understand from the inside. She started the truck and drove back toward town. Brian Thompson was coming out of the hardware store on Main Street when she pulled up, which might have been coincidence and might not, and she was going to have to determine which before she said anything she couldn't take back. He saw her. He stopped. His face did something complicated. Not guilt, not surprise exactly. More like the expression of someone who had been thinking about a problem and was now looking at one of its components. She got out of the truck. Walk with me. He fell into step beside her without asking where. They went to the far end of the block, to the corner where the street dead-ended at a metal guardrail overlooking the harbor mouth. Nobody within earshot. Cold. The water below gray-green in the flat afternoon light. I saw you from our boat this morning. He said it before she could decide how to open. Straightforward. No preamble. I had binoculars on the northeastern shelf. Lucky Hall changed course, and I tracked it. I saw you attach a line to something and spend a long time pulling it toward the eastern cove, and you called your father a beat. Not long. Yeah, I did. I told him I'd seen you acting strange out there, working with something big. He looked at the water. He told me to leave it alone. What exactly did he say? He said, "Leave it alone, Brian. It's not our business." And he said it in the voice he uses when something is already his business and he's trying to make it sound like it isn't. He paused. I've known that voice my whole life. I just haven't had to think about what it meant before. She let that sit for a moment. Then, the boat that's been running the coast. Dark hull, no visible registration. Gary mentioned it was outside the harbor last week. Brian's jaw moved slightly. They came to our dock, tied up on the work float. 3 people, 2 men and a woman, presenting as marine salvage contractors. Asked my father about tidal drift on the eastern coast, about isolated beach access points, about unusual debris in the water column, and your father answered like he knew them. Brian said it carefully, like he was establishing the difference between what he'd observed and what he'd concluded from it. Not like someone working out what they were asking, like someone giving information he already had. And then he went into the office and I heard him on the phone, and when he came out, he stopped. He was normal. Which was the problem. He was too normal. She looked at the harbor, then back at him. Do you know the name Meridian Acquisitions? The name landed on his face the way a name lands when it's connected to something real. He knew it. She watched him know it. It's a company, he said. They invested in Thomas Seafood 3 years ago. My father said it was private equity, that they'd approached him when things were tight. A pause. Things were tight 3 years ago. We almost lost the second trawler, and the investment saved you. It saved the operation. Yes, she didn't say. And you didn't ask what the investment was for, or what it came from, or who was behind the company name. She didn't say it because it wasn't useful, and because she understood. In the specific way of someone who had made her own financial decisions under pressure, and hadn't always had the luxury of full due diligence. How those moments happened. When you needed something badly enough, the questions you didn't ask were the ones you couldn't afford to have answered. There's a police officer, she said. Timothy Clark. Brian nodded. Once. Slow. Can I trust him? He looked at her directly. He's not connected to my father. He's not connected to anything in Harwick in the way that most people here are connected to everything. He paused. Whether that's enough, I don't know. But it's what I have. She nodded. That was honest. Honest was what she needed more than reassurance. One more thing, she said. Do you have a bodom, a radio unit? The kind with range? He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone beginning to understand the full shape of what they'd walked into. Then he said, I have a portable marine radio in the truck. My father made me carry one since I was 14. He said it was safety protocol. A pause. He taught me the Coast Guard frequencies. Something about that, the specific irony of it. Donald Thomas equipping his son with the exact tool that might eventually be used against his own operation. Landed between them without either of them naming it. Keep it close, Nicole said. Tonight, Timothy Clark's office occupied the ground floor of the municipal building, in the space that had been a hardware store before the hardware store relocated to the newer commercial strip on the edge of town. His name was on a placard by the door, installed at a slight angle that nobody had corrected in 6 years. Inside, institutional walls the color of old cream, a metal desk, 2 filing cabinets, a coffee maker that had clearly been running on stubbornness since the previous decade, and Timothy Clark himself, filling out paperwork in longhand with a ballpoint pen. He was 55. Taller than he looked across a dock, reading glasses pushed up when she entered. A single motion, practiced into reflex. The lines on his face were made by weather and sustained attention rather than by time alone. He looked like a man who had been patient about something for a long time and had gotten good at carrying the patience without showing the weight of it. She put the case on his desk. She told him everything in the order she'd experienced it, the container in the water, the decision to tow it, the tool marks on the door in both sets, the older and the recent, the interior, the case, the manifests, the Interpol notations, the company names, the LinkedIn profile connecting Meridian Acquisitions to Maine Seafood Distribution, the handwritten note with the word Thomas, the photographs on her phone, the 3 cloud backups, the additional evidence of activity at the beach in the afternoon, the tracks, the timeline. She did not tell him about the photographs specifically. She described the documents. She did not specify that she'd photographed them and distributed the copies. This was not deception. It was the habit of someone who'd learned that information distributed was information protected, and that you didn't lead with your full hand when you didn't yet know the table. Clark listened without interrupting, without taking notes while she spoke, which was unusual and which she registered. He was listening with the kind of attention that meant he was holding the whole shape of the thing rather than cataloging its parts, which was a different and more useful kind of listening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the case. "How long from the time you found it to the time you came here?" he said. "I went home first. Read the documents. About 3 hours total between the beach and this office. You went back to the site, early afternoon. That's when I found the secondary track evidence, and the tracks came from the waterside. No marks on the seawall approach. They arrived by boat." He looked at her over the top of his glasses in the way of a man recalibrating something. "You know how to read track evidence?" "I know what disturbed sand looks like versus undisturbed sand," she said. "I've been walking beaches for 3 years, looking at what the water leaves. It's a legible condition." He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved. He set it back. He looked at the documents she'd spread across the desk. His finger moved over the manifest, not touching, just tracing the air above the printed columns. Stopped at the company names column. Moved to the email printouts. Stopped at Meridian Acquisitions, the 2019 Portland investigation, he said. Not to her. To himself, or to the room, or to the 5 years he'd been carrying it. Then to her. "I was working a federal case. Interpol referral. Cultural property trafficking through northeastern seaboard ports. Meridian Acquisitions appeared in the financial trail. Peripheral. Connection not fully established, but present." She waited. "The investigation was closed before the connection could be developed," he said. "The official reason was insufficient evidence to proceed. The reason I was given, when I asked for elaboration, was a threshold determination by a deputy director. The reason I believed, which I had no evidence for and still don't, was that someone at a level above the investigation had decided it was more convenient for the investigation to stop." He said it with the flatness of someone who had made peace with the fact that carrying an unresolvable suspicion was simply part of his particular life. Not bitterness, something more like the long acceptance of a person who had chosen to remain in a position anyway, doing the smaller version of the work, because the smaller version still mattered even when the larger version had been taken from him. "I filed an objection to the closure," he continued. "It was noted. I requested a review. The review did not change the outcome. I transferred out of Portland the following year." A pause. "I've been here since." She looked at him. "At what 6 years in a town of 900, after a career that had been pointed towards something larger, had done to a man who still came to work every day and filled out his paperwork by hand. The person who closed it," she said, "retired 6 months after the closure. Sits on the board of a cultural foundation that has, in the past 4 years, acquired several pieces we now have reason to believe were laundered through the network." He said it with precision, each word placed. "That is a pattern. It is not yet admissible fact. But what I have now," she said. "What you have now," he said, and she could see the shift in him. The thing that had been waiting 6 years for a reason to move changes the evidentiary picture. Significantly, he leaned forward. "I cannot process this through local channels. I need to reach the FBI field office in Boston directly, not through county dispatch, not through state. Directly tonight, because local channels might be. Because I don't know which ones aren't." He said it like pulling a splinter, quick, clean over, which is its own answer about the situation. She understood. She thought about what it would mean to work in a place and not be certain the structure of your own work was intact. To do every day what you were supposed to do while carrying the knowledge that the thing you were doing it inside might be compromised in a way you couldn't see and couldn't prove. How long to reach Boston? Tonight, physical presence from their end. Tomorrow morning at the earliest, and between now and tomorrow morning, he looked at her steadily. "That case does not leave your hands. And you do not go back to that beach under any circumstances." She nodded, reached for the case. He stopped her as she reached the door. "Nicole," she turned. "The photographs on your phone," he said. "Flat. Factual. You described the documents with the specificity of someone who has reviewed them very carefully multiple times. People who have done that and are being fully transparent say so. People who have done that and have additionally preserved the information somewhere safe. They describe the documents without specifying format. He paused. It's smart. Keep them where they are. Don't move them. She met his eyes. He looked back at her without pressing for confirmation. She left. She got home at 4:15. Emma was doing multiplication tables at the kitchen table, with the focused, grim determination of someone who found the 8s personally offensive, but was going to get through them on principle. Donna had left a covered plate on the counter with a note that said, "Heat at 350, 10 minutes. Don't forget to eat it this time." Nicole put the plate in the oven, set the timer, put the case under the loose floorboard in the bedroom, the one near the closet corner that flexed underfoot, that she'd known about since the first winter and had never fixed, and which she was now grateful for, in a way that reframed its presence from a maintenance failure into something closer to providence. She came back to the kitchen, sat across from Emma, watched her daughter write 7s with the deliberate care of a surgeon completing a procedure. Emma looked up after a while. "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The thinking about money face." "You do it different from the tired face. The money face, you get a line right here." She pointed to the space between her own brows. "The tired face is more everywhere." Nicole looked at her daughter, 7 years old. Blue eyes that had come from somewhere neither parent could fully account for. Not quite Nicole's gray-blue, not the green-brown Derek's had been. Something in between that was entirely Emma's own. She thought about how to explain to a 7-year-old that the face was not, at the moment, primarily about money, but about the fact that Nicole had spent the day touching the edges of something large and dangerous and had decided to do the right thing about it, and that the right thing was not the same as the safe thing, and that she was working out whether she'd made a mistake by choosing integrity over self-preservation, when self-preservation was also, in a direct way, Emma's preservation. She said, "I had a complicated day." Emma returned to her 8s with the seriousness of someone accepting an incomplete answer and choosing not to push it. Then, without looking up, "My teacher says complicated days are the ones that make you smarter if you don't give up on them." Your teacher is right. She's usually right about things. A beat, as an 8 was completed. "Can we have pancakes with the frozen blueberries on Saturday?" "Yes." "Promise?" "Promise." Emma nodded and moved to the 9s, which she clearly found more manageable than the 8s, based on the slight relaxation in her shoulders. Nicole ate the food from the oven, looked at the window over the sink, which showed her only the dark of the early Maine evening, and thought about the container on the beach, and the boatswain, and the man in Boston, that Clark was going to note, and the case, under the floorboard, and the fact that the next few hours were going to require her to do the thing she had the most difficulty with. Wait. Just wait, without doing anything, without controlling anything. Just be in the house with her daughter, and trust that the pieces she'd set in motion were moving in the right direction. She got Emma through homework and dinner, and the bath routine, and the 2 stuffed animals arranged in their specific positions, and the lighthouse nightlight switched on. She sat on the edge of the mattress. "Tell me a boat thing," Emma said, already most of the way to sleep. This was the ritual. Not a story. Emma had graduated from stories when she decided actual information was more interesting. A boat thing. "Something true. When the water looks completely flat," Nicole said, "there's still current underneath. The whole ocean is moving all the time, doing everything it always does. You just can't see it from the surface because the surface looks calm. But the current's there. The fish are moving. Everything is happening under what you can see." Emma considered this for a moment, eyes at half-mast. "Is that a metaphor?" "A little." "Okay." She settled deeper into the pillow. "Night, Mom." Nicole turned off the light, stood in the doorway one moment, then went to the back steps with her phone. She called her mother, Sharon Ramirez, the name taken from her second husband, kept after the divorce because it was on the nursing license, and changing it had seemed like more administrative grief than the situation warranted. Answered after the second ring in the slightly alert way. She always answered Nicole's late calls, the way of a woman who had been a nurse and had learned that late calls meant something was happening. You're outside, Sharon said. Back step. It's cold there. Yes. Nicole looked at the narrow strip of harbor visible between rooftops. Mom, if you found something not yours, something connected to something bad, you didn't cause it, it's not your fault. But now you have it, and you're the one who has to decide what to do with it. And doing the right thing doesn't solve the practical problem. It might make the practical problem worse for a while. Silence. Her mother thinking, not hesitating, thinking, and Nicole knew the difference. You already know what to do, Sharon said. If you didn't, you'd be calling to ask me what to do. You're calling to hear someone say it back to you. Nicole sat with that for a moment. I just needed confirmation, she said. You're going to be okay. Her mother's voice had the particular warmth of 30 years of telling people true things in difficult moments. Not because it'll be easy, because you know what you're doing and you're going to do it. After she hung up, she sat on the back steps for 10 more minutes. She thought about her father coming home with the stranger's wallet and the $300 he'd put back where he found it. She thought about the way he'd looked at dinner, not lighter, not vindicated, just settled. Like the argument inside him had stopped. She went in, checked the floorboard. Case still there. She was at the front window at 9:50, not paranoid, just watching. Or telling herself the distinction still held. When the SUV went past, black. Knew enough to be anonymous. Moving at the pace of something that had no particular destination but had a general purpose. It passed the house and continued down the block and turned at the corner and was gone. She stepped back from the window. 5 minutes later, it came back from the other direction. Same pace. 20 minutes after that, it didn't pass. It stopped. At the end of the block, engine still running, exhaust visible in the cold air, no sound reaching her through the glass and the distance, just sat there. Nicole stood in the dark kitchen and looked at the shape of the SUV at the end of the street and understood, in the space of a few seconds, that they had not found the container tonight. They had found her. She picked up her phone, texted Brian Thompson. Dark SUV on my street, end of the block, engine running. How fast can you get to the corner of Mill and Harbor? His reply came in under a minute, 10 minutes. Call Clark now. She called Clark. He answered immediately. They found me, she said. Location? End of my block. Engine running, sitting still. Is Emma in the house? Asleep. Good. Don't turn lights on. Don't open the door. I'll be there in 8 minutes. A pause. Brian Thompson, he's coming? Good. Nicole. His voice was the exact opposite of the situation outside. Solid, unmovable, oriented. You made the right call bringing this in today. She looked at the SUV at the end of the street. I know, she said, and she did. She knew it with the same completeness she'd known it in the container. Not as comfort, not as resolution, but as the orientation that meant she could keep moving even when the direction was hard. 8 minutes, Clark said, and ended the call. She stood in the dark kitchen. The lighthouse nightlight sent its small, steady beam down the hallway from Emma's room. She looked at it, counted her own heartbeats until she stopped counting because it wasn't helping. Outside, the SUV did not move. Clark arrived in 7 minutes. No lights. He'd parked 2 blocks over and walked, appearing from the side alley rather than the street, moving with the economy of a man for whom this kind of entrance was procedural rather than dramatic. Nicole had the back door open before he reached it. He stepped inside. Did the same assessment she'd watched him do in his office. Room, then hallway, then her face, still at the end of the block. Hasn't moved. He took out his phone, typed something, put it back. Brian is 2 minutes out. I told him the back way, through the Anderson property on the north side. She nodded. I need you to listen to what we're going to do, he said. Not urgent, just direct. We are not going to the container tonight. We are not going near the beach under any circumstances. What we're doing is getting you and Emma out of this house, to somewhere these people can't watch, and we're doing it without them knowing you've gone. He looked at the hallway. Emma wakes quietly when she needs to. She knows how to not make noise. A pause. She learned. Clark absorbed that without pressing it. The particular discretion of someone who understood that some things about a child's adaptations were not his to ask about. 10 minutes, he said. Her shoes. 1 bag. Nicole was already moving down the hallway. Waking Emma at 10:15 required the specific calibration of a mother who knew exactly how her child processed alarm. She sat on the edge of the mattress, put her hand on Emma's shoulder, said her name twice, quiet. Emma came up from sleep and read Nicole's face in the lighthouse light with the accuracy of a child who had learned to read faces early, because faces were the advance warning system that mattered most. She didn't ask what was wrong. She sat. "Shoes are by the door," Emma said in the flat, practical voice of a 7-year-old accepting a situation. "Pack the blue bag." 5 minutes, Emma nodded, and was already moving before the sentence finished. And there it was again. The thing Nicole could never name cleanly, the feeling that lived in the space between gratitude and grief when she watched her daughter pack efficiently and silently at 10:15 at night. The competence was good. The circumstances that had made the competence necessary were something else entirely. You didn't get to separate them. They arrived together. Brian Thompson came over the back fence at 10:20. He moved less cleanly than Clark. He was 24, and this was not something he'd trained for. But he moved fast, and he moved quiet, and he came straight to the back door without hesitation, which meant he'd already decided something before he got there. He came into the kitchen and looked at Clark, looked at Nicole, looked at Emma, who looked back at him with the frank evaluative gaze of a 7-year-old, establishing the parameters of a stranger. "You're tall," Emma said. "I've been told," Brian said. Emma appeared to find this satisfactory, and went back to zipping her blue bag. Brian looked at Nicole. His face carried the expression of a man who had been running his own calculation all afternoon, and had arrived at a number that cost something. "My father knows you have the case," he said. "I don't know specifically how, but he called me an hour ago and told me to stay away from you and to let things work themselves out." He sounded, a pause. He sounded like someone who was afraid and was managing the fear by telling himself the situation was manageable. "He knows where I live," she said. It wasn't a question. "He knows where everyone in Harwick lives." Brian held her gaze. "I need you to know that when I called him from the boat this morning, I didn't know what you'd found. I didn't know what he was involved in. I called because I saw something unusual, and he was the first number I dialed. That's all it was." The distinction mattered to him. She could see it was the thing he'd been carrying since that afternoon. The need to establish the difference between being complicit and being someone's unwitting relay. She understood the need. She also understood that the difference, while real, didn't change the practical outcome of the call. "I know," she said. "It's okay," he nodded once. Seemed to settle slightly. "The radio," Clark said. Brian unshouldered the canvas bag. "Marine portable. My father made me carry one since I was 14. I know the Coast Guard frequencies. He taught me." He set the bag on the counter. Something in the way he said it, the specific quiet of someone cataloging what they'd been given by a person whose relationship to them had just become more complicated, was the kind of thing you filed away and didn't comment on. "Good," Clark said. "We're going to need it." Outside, at the end of the block, the SUV's exhaust was still visible in the cold air. They had a plan. They had a direction. They had the case under the floorboard, and the photographs in 3 cloud locations, and a man who had been waiting 5 years for this particular file, and was now moving. Nicole looked at Emma, blue bag over one shoulder. Standing in the kitchen in the reliable way she stood in things she didn't fully understand. Feet planted, face calm, ready. The thing about doing the right thing, Nicole had learned in the past 12 hours, was that it didn't stop being hard once you'd decided to do it. It just became a different kind of hard. The kind with a direction. The kind you could walk through instead of around. She picked up her jacket. "Let's go," she said. The North Marsh at night was a country that didn't belong to the same coastline as the harbor. No wave break. No engine noise carrying from the docks. No gull calls. Just wind moving through the reed beds in long lateral sweeps, and water finding its way through the channels with the sound of something that had been doing this since before anyone was here to name it. The smell was different too. Brackish and organic and dense, the accumulated history of a wetland that processed everything the coast sent through it and gave nothing back but more marsh. They'd left Emma at Donna's. That had been the first stop. Donna's back door, which opened before Nicole could knock, because Donna Jackson had been awake, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant she had understood from the coffee she'd placed on the counter that afternoon, that something was going to require her to be available later. Emma had gone to her half asleep, without protest, her blue bag bumping against the doorframe. Donna had taken her with the practiced ease of someone who had held children through difficult nights before, decades of such nights, and her grip was steady, and her face was calm, and she looked at Nicole over Emma's shoulder, with the look that said, "I have her. Go, do what you need to do." Nicole had stood in the doorway for one breath longer than necessary, looking at Emma's face, slack and untroubled in Donna's arms, memorizing it the way you memorize things before going somewhere uncertain. Not consciously, not deliberately, but the way the mind reaches for anchors when the ground is moving. Then she'd turned and gone back to the truck. Clark drove north on the paved road and parked where the pavement ended and the marsh began. They walked from there, Clark with a flashlight held low, Brian with the canvas bag over one shoulder, the weight of the radio unit visible in the slight hike of that shoulder. Nicole with the case tucked under her jacket against her ribs, arms folded over it. She didn't use a flashlight. She navigated from the single afternoon she'd spent here 2 years ago, when Gary had taken her out in the flat-bottom skiff to show her how the back coast connected. The channels, the inlets, the way water moved differently in sheltered water than it did in the open sound. She hadn't known she was storing the geography for future use. She'd just been paying attention the way she paid attention to everything, because the thing you didn't register was the thing that eventually caught you. Left at the junction, where the channel widened and the reeds grew higher. Right at the fallen section of the old wooden walkway that the Coastal Survey had put in and never maintained. Straight through the narrowing, where the reed beds pressed in from both sides, and the ground went soft and her boots pulled slightly with each step. She made each choice without consulting Clark, who had fallen into following her rather than leading, which was a shift neither of them remarked on. The shack was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps it was the same size, and what she remembered was slightly wrong, the way memories of places always drift slightly from the places themselves over time. One room. The roof had developed a lean in the years since she'd last been here, the east wall settling, the whole structure bowing slightly in the direction the prevailing wind came from. The Coastal Survey emblem above the door had reduced to a suggestion, a shape where paint had been, the outline of a shield, the color gone. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the cold mineral smell of a space that had been sealed and damp and sealed again over many seasons. Shelves on 2 walls, life vests in a stack, orange gone pale, emergency flares in a box that had been there long enough to be decorative. A metal desk with a surface that had rusted lightly at the edges and on the desk. The radio unit. Brian was already at it, setting down the portable unit from the canvas bag, looking at the fixed unit with the assessing expression of someone who had learned to evaluate equipment by handling it rather than by reading about it. "Battery backup," Nicole said. Under the desk, he crouched, found it, looked up, showing charge. He connected it. The radio unit produced a hum, low, specific, the sound of a system gathering itself. Not the hum of something broken producing noise, but the hum of something functional waking up. Then, static, continuous and even. She took the transmit. "This is Nicole Torres calling from Harwick, Maine, North Marsh sector. I have urgent information regarding an active, Interpol-flagged cultural property trafficking case. I am at risk from parties connected to the case. I need direct contact with United States Coast Guard or federal law enforcement. Please respond." Static. She waited 10 seconds. Tried again, adjusting the frequency one step the way Brian had shown her on the walk-in, talking her through the dial settings in low practical sentences, teaching her something useful at the exact moment she needed to know it, which was a specific kind of help she would remember. "This is Nicole Torres, Harwick, Maine, North Marsh. Repeat. Urgent contact regarding federal criminal matter. I have documentary evidence in hand. I am requesting immediate response on this channel." The static changed quality, organized itself, and then a voice clipped and clear. "Copy that." Identify your precise location. She reached for the topographic map Brian had brought. Physical backup. Clark had insisted paper didn't need a signal, and read the grid reference she'd marked before they left the paved road. The dispatcher asked her to repeat it. She repeated it, and then the sound behind her, not a voice. Not a signal, a structural sound, the specific compression of a door being tested from the outside, weight applied to assess resistance, the sound of someone who wanted to know what was on the other side before committing to being on this side. Clark moved first, not toward the door, to the right wall, out of the direct sightline from the doorframe, pressing flat. One hand up, palm toward her stop. Stay. Nicole held the transmit button down. The connection was live. She could hear the dispatcher's ambient breath on the other end, waiting. The door opened, one man. A flashlight that came in ahead of him, sweeping the room. Caught the desk, the radio, Nicole's hand on the transmit button, then her face. He stepped fully into the doorway and stopped. He was not large in a physical way that was threatening. He was large in the way that men who have been doing something for a long time, without consequence, are large. A kind of solidity that came from operating in spaces where nobody had ever successfully pushed back. He looked at her, looked at the radio, looked at the case on the desk, 15 feet between them. The length of a room that was smaller than her kitchen, she did not step back. Not because she was being deliberate about it. There was no step back available. The wall was behind her. So she stood where she was and let the distance between them remain what it was and said, in a voice that arrived steadier than she had any right to expect from herself in that moment, "I've been on an open channel with Coast Guard for the past 4 minutes. They have my grid location. They're already moving." He looked at the radio, at the green indicator light showing active connection. At the mic she still held with her thumb on the transmit button. She watched him calculate. He'd come for the case, possibly for her as the loose end who had reached the container first. The clean resolution was to take both and convert this evening from a problem into a solved problem. She could see the calculation on his face with the same clarity she could read weather on the water. It had a shape and a direction, and she could track where it was going. But the radio was on. The channel was live. The Coast Guard dispatcher was there, and the dispatcher had a location, and he did not know where Brian Thompson was, because Brian had moved behind the equipment shelving when the door first moved, and had not been visible when the light swept the room. The man stood in the doorway for 5 seconds. Then he turned and walked back into the dark. Nicole pressed transmit. "Confirm you have my location. Confirm you are responding." The dispatcher. Confirmed location. Coast Guard sector vessel ETA approximately 35 minutes via water approach. Stay on channel. She stayed on channel. Clark came off the wall. He looked at the door. Looked at her. Brian emerged from behind the shelving, moving carefully. "I tracked him to the channel edge," he said quietly. "He had a kayak pulled up in the reeds. He's gone." The three of them stood in the shack, and no one spoke for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, and exactly as long as it had to be. Then Brian said, "He's going to report back that you've called it in. They'll know within the hour that the case is in federal hands, which means they'll stop coming after it," Clark said. "Or they'll move faster." Brian's voice was level, thinking out loud, not panicking. "Depends how much they think they can recover before the Coast Guard gets here." "They can't recover anything in 35 minutes that matters," Nicole said. "The documents are in 3 cloud locations. The case is here. The container is on the beach, and it's too heavy to move without equipment they didn't bring." Clark looked at her, then at the radio. "Keep the channel open," he said, and went to the doorway to watch the dark. The Coast Guard inflatable came up the primary channel in 41 minutes, not 35. The marsh geography had slowed the water approach in a way the dispatcher hadn't fully accounted for, and the flat bottom capability needed for this specific channel had required a vessel change at the sector dock, which added time. Nicole learned all of this afterward. In the shack, she tracked time by counting her own breathing, and by the sound of the channel water against the reeds outside, and by the fact that Clark remained in the doorway without moving, which she took to mean nothing was coming from the land side. When the inflatable's light appeared in the channel, it appeared without warning, suddenly there, rounding the bend in the reeds, moving steady and low in the water. The boatswain, who climbed out at the marsh edge, was young, Mr. David Cole. Maybe 27, with the composed efficiency of someone who had trained extensively for situations worse than this one, and was processing a mild surprise that this was what the training had been called for tonight. He looked at the case under Nicole's arm, at Clark's badge. At Brian, anyone need medical attention? No, Nicole said. You made the original radio contact? Yes. The evidence you referenced is in that case? Documentary evidence, yes. I also have photographs of all documents distributed across 3 cloud backups and a sent email chain. He wrote something on the pad he was carrying, then looked up. Smart. I used to study accounting, she said. You keep 2 copies of everything before you do anything with the original. He almost smiled. Didn't quite. We're going to need you to come with us. She looked at Clark. He nodded once. She looked at Brian. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and the expression of someone who was standing at the end of a long chain of decisions and could see all the way back to the first one. The binoculars, the call to his father from the boat, the radio frequency he'd grown up knowing. Whatever he was working through with that chain, he was doing it quietly and without asking anyone to help him carry it. Brian, she said. He looked at her. You did the right thing tonight? He held her gaze for a moment, then looked at the channel where the inflatable was waiting. Go, he said. I'll lock up the shack, she went. The inflatable carried them up the channel and out into the small, sheltered inlet, and from there to the larger water where the sector vessel was holding position, with its lights making quiet arcs in the dark. Someone on the vessel handed her a blanket that smelled of industrial laundering and was the most welcome thing she'd held in hours. Someone else handed her coffee that was too hot and tasted like salvation. The boatswain sat across from her in the cabin. We've been in contact with FBI Boston since your first radio transmission was logged. An agent is already en route from the field office. She'll meet us at the Harwick Municipal Dock. Nicole held the coffee with both hands. How long? She left Boston 40 minutes ago. She'll be there when we dock. Nicole looked at the water through the cabin window. The dark surface, the running lights reflecting in broken lines, the coast visible as a darker shape against the dark sky. Somewhere along that coast was the beach where a red container sat on a sand flat, full of things that had traveled an enormous distance from where they belonged and were finally, in whatever complicated way events worked themselves out, going to start traveling back. She thought about the statue she'd touched, the cool surface, the patience of it. She thought about Emma asleep on Donna's couch. She thought, whatever the tide brings, you read it first, and then you decide what to do with what you've read. She held the blanket around her shoulders and watched the coast go by and let herself, for the first time in 2 days, stop managing the next minute. Special Agent Stephanie Harris was standing on the Harwick Municipal Dock when the sector vessel came in at 20 past midnight, 42 years old. Dark jacket over a collared shirt, no attempt at casual. The specific composure of someone for whom intensity was a resting state, rather than a response to conditions. She had a badge in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, and she was looking at the vessel, the way someone looks at a thing they've been waiting for, without knowing precisely what form it would take when it arrived. She didn't introduce herself with context, just the name, the badge, and walk with me. They went to the conference room in the municipal building that Clark had cleared earlier in the evening. Tables pushed to one side, chairs arranged, a folding table set up with equipment that hadn't been there at 4 o'clock that afternoon. 2 people in civilian clothes who didn't give names were already working at laptops. The coffee maker in the corner was running, which struck Nicole as the most grounding detail in the room. Harris sat across from her. Yellow legal pad. Pen clicked. From the beginning, Harris said. Everything. Nicole went through it. She went through it the way she'd learned to go through accounting reconciliations. In order, without omitting the parts that didn't reflect well on her decisions, without editorializing, without landing on conclusions before she'd established the facts that supported them. The container in the water, the decision to tow it, the tool marks, both sets, and the difference in the weathering that told her which were older and which were recent. The interior. The case, the manifests, the Interpol notations, the shifted names, the company shells, the LinkedIn profile, the handwritten note, the photographs, taken in sequence, distributed to 3 locations before she'd left the beach. The return to the beach in the afternoon, the tracks, the timeline she'd constructed, Timothy Clark. The documents spread on her kitchen desk, the SUV. Emma's name said in the dark to a man who had told her to keep Emma asleep and get out without turning the lights on. The marsh, the shack, the radio, the man in the doorway. Harris listened with the stillness of someone who was doing multiple things at once, internally processing, cross-referencing, building a structure from the material being given to her, while externally she sat still and wrote selective notes on the legal pad and did not interrupt. When Nicole finished, Harris was quiet for 30 seconds, looked at the pad, looked at the case on the table between them. The photographs, Harris said. I was waiting for that. You described every document with the specificity of someone who had looked at each one more than once and had also done something to preserve what they'd seen, Harris said. People who have only handled documents describe them differently. You described them like someone who had also photographed them. 3 cloud backups, Nicole said, and an email sent from a secondary account to my primary account and 2 others. I want those sent to an encrypted address I'll give you now. You keep the originals. We receive copies. Does that work? Yes. Harris slid a card across the table. An email address handwritten on the back, nothing printed on the front. The case, she said, and looked at it. Nicole picked it up, held it for a moment. She had been holding it in one form or another since 9 in the morning, in the container, in the truck, under the floorboard, against her ribs in the marsh. The physical weight of it was less than its functional weight, and she was aware of the distinction even as she set it on the table and slid it toward Harris. Harris took it without ceremony, set it to one side and looked back at Nicole. I need to tell you something, Harris said. I don't usually tell witnesses this because it reveals institutional failure, and institutions don't like being revealed. But I think you're owed the context. She set down the pen. I've been working cultural property trafficking cases for 6 years, she said. Meridian Acquisitions has appeared at the edges of 3 separate investigations in that time. Always peripheral. Always connected enough to be visible and disconnected enough to avoid direct implication. The network it's part of has been operating for at least 8 years and has moved an estimated $40 million in stolen cultural heritage through the Northeastern Corridor. She paused. The 2019 Portland investigation that Timothy Clark was part of was the closest anyone had gotten to the center of it. When that investigation closed, I filed a formal objection and requested review. The objection was noted and the review returned the same outcome. Nicole looked at her. The deputy director who closed it retired 6 months after closure. Currently sits on the board of a private cultural foundation that has acquired, in the past 4 years, pieces we now have strong reason to believe were laundered through this network. Harris held her gaze. That is a pattern. It is not yet an indictment. It will become one. She reached across the table and drew the case closer. What you've given me tonight connects the center of this network to a local logistics contact, establishes a document trail that survives the chain of custody requirements I need, and provides corroborating evidence for patterns we've been tracking without the piece that made them prosecutable. She paused. You gave me the piece. Nicole sat with that for a moment, with the specific quality of understanding that what had felt personal and small, the truck loan, the $47, the container that might solve the problem of not having enough, had simultaneously been the missing center of a federal case that had been running for years without resolution. Scale was strange. The things that felt largest in your own life were sometimes the same things that connected to something much larger, and the connection ran both directions, whether you knew it was there or not. What happens now? She said. Now, Harris said we work, and you go see your daughter. Donna's kitchen at 7 in the morning had the specific warmth of a small house that had been heated all night against the cold, and that smelled of coffee and the particular domestic steadiness of a woman who made steadiness her practice. Emma was at the table with cereal and the blue bag still on the floor beside her chair, positioned as if she'd decided to keep it accessible. When Nicole came through the back door, Emma looked up and performed a rapid and thorough assessment. "You look tired," Emma said. "I'm okay?" "You look tired and okay both, yes." Nicole sat down across from her and poured coffee from the pot on the counter. "That's about right." Emma ate a spoonful of cereal, watched her mother. "Is it finished?" "The hard part. For us. Yes. What about the rest?" "The rest belongs to other people now." She held the coffee with both hands and felt the warmth of it go through her palms. "Other people whose job it is to handle the rest." Emma processed this with the seriousness she applied to information she was deciding how to file. "Then, can we have pancakes today instead of Saturday? With the blueberries?" "Yes," Nicole said. "We can have them whenever you want." Emma nodded, as if this resolved something. Went back to her cereal. Donna found Nicole on the back step at 9, which was where Nicole had gone when she needed to think, without walls pressing on her thinking. She'd taken coffee and her jacket, and she was sitting on the step watching the harbor slice, visible between the houses across the street. That narrow strip of blue-gray that was the ocean being ordinary at a distance. Donna sat beside her. Not immediately adjacent, one step lower, which put her at a different angle, which was the Donna version of giving a person their air while still being present. "Gary called," Donna said. "He's at the dock. He says Lucky Hall is ready when you want her. He says she runs fine." A pause. "He was there before 5 this morning," which meant Gary had been working on the engine in the dark and the cold, on a boat that wasn't his, for a person who hadn't asked and wouldn't be expected to ask. Which was the Gary Anderson version of saying everything he found unnecessary to say with words. "How much do I owe him for the truck?" Nicole asked. "He said not to worry about it. I'm going to pay him." "I know that," Donna said. "He knows that. He just wanted to say it." She looked at the harbor. "Some people show you they care by how much they spend on you. Gary shows it by what he does before you have to ask." Nicole held her coffee. The steam moved sideways in the light wind. Donna, she didn't look over. The cardiac imaging. The tests the Portland doctor wants. "I want to help cover what insurance doesn't." Donna made a sound that was not quite acceptance and not quite deflection. The sound of a woman who was going to allow something and hadn't decided to admit that yet. "We'll work something out," Donna said. "Yes," Nicole said. "We will." They sat on the step and looked at the harbor and the seagulls making their practiced arcs over the water, and the light on the surface that changed every time the clouds shifted and was never exactly the same thing twice. 2 days after the shack, the debrief sessions with Harris began. 3 sessions over 2 days, in the same conference room, with the same yellow pad and the encrypted email address, and the coffee that was better than Clark's machine produced. Each session added detail to the federal picture. Harris building her case brick by brick, needing Nicole to confirm specific details, to authenticate the sequence of the photographs, to establish the chain of custody for the original documents. Brian Thompson sat in the first session as a secondary witness. He gave his account without hedging and without shading. What he'd seen from the trawler, what his father said when he called, what he'd observed about his father's manner, when the men from the dark boat came to the Thomas seafood dock. He described his father's phone call to him the evening of the SUV, the instruction to stay away and let things work out. He said it all with the particular flatness of someone who had accepted that accuracy was more important right now than protection, even when the person who needed protection was his father. Afterward, in the hallway, Nicole said, "That was hard to do." "Yeah." He looked at the closed conference room door. "I keep running the same calculation. If he didn't know what Meridian Acquisitions was when they offered him money 3 years ago, if he genuinely didn't know, then he made one bad decision under pressure, and everything else followed from it without him fully understanding what he was inside." He paused. "And if he did know, then he made a different choice. And I have to figure out what to do with either version." She looked at him. 24 years old, standing in a municipal building hallway, trying to hold 2 possible versions of his father's character simultaneously while the facts were still being established. "I don't think you do anything with it yet," she said. "I think you carry it for a while and let it tell you its shape before you decide what to do with it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not very satisfying." "No," she said. "It's not." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not resolved, not settled, but slightly less braced. "Okay," he said. And that was that. The federal operation moved at the speed that federal operations moved, which was faster than it looked from the outside and slower than it felt from the inside. Edward Harris, Donald Thomas's brother, the man whose signature sat at the bottom of the document chain as North American Distribution Coordinator for a network that had been moving stolen cultural heritage for 8 years, was arrested at his Miami residence 3 days after Harris's team finished processing the contents of the case. The arrest was reported briefly in the Miami Herald, and then picked up by the wire services and distributed in the way that crime stories were distributed, which was widely and without full context. Donald Thomas entered a cooperation agreement 5 days after the container was secured. The agreement meant his name appeared in subsequent reporting in a different register than his brother's. Not exonerated, not cleared, but positioned differently in the legal taxonomy of the situation. Nicole understood that this distinction was partly procedural and partly the law, making approximate gestures at the difference between a man who had knowingly built something corrupt and a man who had made a decision under pressure and then been too afraid to unwind it. She didn't know which version of Donald Thomas was accurate. She suspected he didn't know either, entirely. Timothy Clark was referenced in the federal press release as a local law enforcement officer who had played a key role in evidence collection and chain of custody. 2 sentences. He would not have wanted more. She knew that about him the way you came to know things about people who expressed themselves through what they didn't require. Kenneth Lee's photograph appeared in the Boston Globe piece that ran 2 weeks after the arrests. It ran as a sidebar. Identified as documentary evidence submitted by a local journalist, showing 2 individuals at the Harwick dock in the company of men now identified as connected to the trafficking operation. Kenneth had taken it through the window of the coffee shop on Main Street 7 days before the container appeared. He'd sent it to Clark the night of the shack, from home, after seeing the activity in town and retrieving the image from his phone's camera roll. He texted Nicole when the piece ran. "My editor asked why I didn't write this story myself. I told him I was too close to it. He said that's the wrong reason. I said it was the only one I had." She wrote back, "That's the right reason then." Nothing came back, which was the right response, and which confirmed that Kenneth Lee understood more about the relationship between proximity and accuracy than his age might have suggested. The artifacts remained in federal custody for 11 weeks, pending coordination with 4 governments, an Interpol repatriation desk, and 2 separate legal frameworks governing the return of cultural property across international boundaries. Nicole did not follow the legal details closely. She had done the part she could do. The rest was other people's expertise, and she trusted expertise in areas she didn't have it. 3 months after the container was secured, the Boston Globe ran a second piece, cultural section. A ceremony in Lagos, a photograph showing rows of artifacts arranged on tables, officials from 4 countries, the specific gravity of objects being formally returned to the places they had been taken from. In the photograph, toward the left side, was the stone figure she'd touched in the container, the one with the carved face that held something between patience and attention, the one she'd pulled her hand back from because the surface of it communicated, without words, that she was touching something whose context she was not part of. It was in its context now. Emma was at the kitchen table, across from her on a Saturday morning that smelled like the blueberry pancakes she'd promised and that she'd made good on. The blueberries from the freezer, the griddle seasoned the way her mother had taught her. Emma's plate with the stack slightly smaller than Nicole's because Emma always announced she wasn't very hungry and then asked for more. Emma pulled the newspaper toward her, looked at the photograph. "That's the statue," she said. Not asking. Yes, she looked at it for a long time, in the way she looked at things when she was storing them rather than simply registering them. The anglerfish diagram, the first snow of the previous winter. the lighthouse nightlight in the general store. Emma filed things that mattered to her, in a place she didn't explain and didn't need to. It went home, she said. Yes. Emma pushed the newspaper back, picked up her fork. Good, she said, and meant it with the complete and uncomplicated sincerity that 7-year-olds were still capable of, and that became more complicated as they got older. And Nicole was in no hurry for that particular complication to arrive. 2 months after the container was secured, Nicole Torres received a letter from the Department of Homeland Security. The letter was formal and careful in its language, the way government letters were careful, threading the specific needle between acknowledging what had been done and establishing the parameters of what was being offered in response. The Informant Reward Program, her contribution to a federal investigation that had resulted in multiple arrests, the recovery of approximately 147 items of stolen cultural heritage, valued in excess of $11 million on the secondary market, and the dismantling of a trafficking network that had operated across 7 countries for 8 years. The number in the letter was not disclosed here, because Nicole had requested that it not be disclosed to anyone, including in any official communication that might be subject to public records requests. It was a private number, between her and the federal government and no one else, but it was real, and it was enough to retire the truck loan, which she did on a Tuesday afternoon by calling the creditor, and making a payment in full and staying on the line while they confirmed it, and then sitting in the truck in the parking lot of the credit union for 5 minutes without starting the engine. Enough to cover Donna's cardiac imaging and the follow-up appointments the imaging recommended and the medication adjustment the cardiologist in Portland prescribed after reviewing the results. She paid this in a way Donna could accept, through Gary, framed as a contribution from the dock community to one of its longtime members, which was both a construction and also true, and which Donna received with the particular grace of a woman who understood when something was a gift and chose to receive it as such. Enough to secure Emma's art class through the end of the school year, paid in full up front, which meant Nicole would not spend the next 8 months calculating whether the $40 would be available each month, and enough to make the call to Gary Anderson that she'd been building toward since the morning she'd climbed aboard Lucky Hole and felt the familiar flex of a boat that had come to fit her, the way tools come to fit the hands that use them most. I want to buy her, she said. Gary was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment that was longer than most of his moments. You don't have the number yet, he said. I have enough for a substantial deposit, and I'll have the rest within 60 days. Another pause. The boat's worth what I'd ask for her. I know. I'm going to pay what she's worth. He was quiet again. Then, she's yours to use until the paperwork's done. Same boat either way, which was Gary's version of yes, and also his version of, I always thought this was how it was going to go, and also his version of, I'm not going to make more of this than it needs to be, all delivered simultaneously in the particular compression of a man who found words efficient when necessary, and otherwise preferred to express things by being at the dock before 5 in the morning and servicing an engine in the dark. Thank you, Gary, she said. He made a sound that acknowledged the thanks without requiring it. Then, mackerel's moving northeast this week. Early mornings, I know, she said. I'll be out. The morning she went back on the water was a Wednesday in late November. Cold. The sky doing that thing it did in late autumn in Maine, where it couldn't quite decide between gray and blue, and settled on both simultaneously in different portions depending on where you looked. She was at the dock at 5:30. Gary was in the canvas chair with the thermos. He grunted when she came down the ramp, which was his version of good morning, and she nodded back, which was hers. Lucky Hall was at the slip. The engine had been serviced. She could tell before she started it from the quality of the mechanism, when she primed it, from the way the throttle responded, from the specific cleanliness of the fuel line connection. Gary had been here before her. Of course he had. She cast off bow and stern, eased out of the slip, felt the familiar flex of the hull meeting open water, the specific movement of a boat she'd been on enough that her body had absorbed its patterns and responded to them. Before her mind caught up, Brian Thompson was on the dock when she passed. Not on a Thomas seafood vessel. The operations was still under suspension, pending the investigation's findings. The second trawler dry docked. The dock paperwork handled by Brian himself, while things were sorted. He was doing something with a mooring line. Practical work. The kind of work you did when you needed something to do with your hands while the larger situation remained unresolved. He looked up when Lucky Hole passed. She raised a hand. He raised one back. No more than that. The particular economy of people who understood each other well enough to not need more. She pushed the throttle forward as she cleared the breakwater. The open swell met her. The first push and give of unobstructed water. The specific physical language of the ocean being itself, with nothing between you and the horizon to moderate it. She felt it in her feet and her knees and the place between her shoulder blades where she'd been carrying something tight for weeks. And, which was now, gradually and without ceremony, beginning to let go. The eastern sky was doing the November thing. The sun not yet risen, the horizon a thin line of pale light between the dark of the water and the dark of the sky. Everything in between the specific shade of blue that was the last darkness before morning rather than darkness proper. She pointed the bow northeast. Thought about Emma at Donna's table in the morning, eating cereal with a seriousness that was entirely her own, and that Nicole had stopped trying to trace back to its source, and had started simply accepting as a fact about her daughter, the way you accepted facts about weather. Thought about the stone statue in the Lagos ceremony photograph, returned to the context it had been removed from, surrounded by people for whom its presence was not a museum curiosity, but a thread in the fabric of who they were. Thought about a man who had returned a wallet with $300 in it and said nothing about it until dinner, and what his face had looked like when he said it. Not lighter, not righteous, just settled. The argument inside him resolved, the account balanced in a way that had nothing to do with the money. The water opened ahead of her, vast and cold and absolutely indifferent to her presence in it, which was the thing she'd come to understand about the ocean after 3 years of depending on it. It didn't care. It gave what it gave and withheld what it withheld, and the same conditions that produced a good catch one morning produced nothing the next. And none of it was personal, and there was something clarifying about working in a system that was fundamentally honest even when it was harsh. You couldn't lie to the ocean. You could only read it correctly or incorrectly, and the results of the reading were immediate and consequential, and that was a kind of fairness that she had come to value more than she'd expected to. When she'd first arrived in Harwick with a 7-month-old, and a number that didn't add up, and a truck that needed a new blower motor she hadn't been able to afford yet. She still hadn't replaced the blower motor, actually. She added it to the list that lived behind her eyes, the running ledger that never fully cleared. Blower motor, Emma's spring boots, call her mother on Sunday, thank Kenneth Lee properly for the photograph, which she hadn't done yet in any form that counted. Ask Gary about the mooring line on the starboard cleat that had been slightly loose for 2 months and which she'd been compensating for, rather than addressing. The list was shorter than it used to be. Some things had been cleared from it. New things would arrive. They always did. The list was not a problem to be solved, but a condition of being the kind of person who paid attention to what needed doing, and intended to do it. She was that kind of person. She had always been that kind of person. The 3 years in Harwick and the contents of a shipping container and the hours in a marsh shack and the conversation with a federal agent in a conference room at midnight had not changed that. If anything, they had confirmed it. Lucky Hall moved through the dark water, northeast toward the shelf where the mackerel were running, and the sky ahead of her was lightening at the edge in the specific way that preceded every dawn, the darkness becoming something other than dark, the light arriving not with announcement, but with the gradual accumulation of itself, until suddenly you looked up and realized. The stars were gone, and the world had colors again, and another day was doing what days did. She kept her speed steady. She did not look back.